welcome. Happy Friday. My name is Josh KAMPEL, the CEO of Techonomy. Thanks for joining us for this important conversation. We really want to thank Nestlé Waters for working with us on curating this conversation, as well as supporting us, as far as really important conversations. We hosted a session with Nestlé Waters not too long ago about education. This one obviously taking a global view on sustainability. And before we get into the conversation, I want to introduce David TULAUSKAS from Nestlé Waters to talk a little about why supporting these types of conversations are really important. So David, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Josh, and thank all of you for joining today. Listen, 2020 represents a critical moment and, quite frankly, a great opportunity to collectively determine our path forward. COVID-19 and the related disruptions may have made it tempting for some businesses and organizations to reduce focus on long-term sustainability goals. More than ever, though, it's critical time to focus on sustainability. We need to manage for today while simultaneously planning for the future. And if we all are to mitigate the near and future realities of climate change, we need to make large-scale changes. Everyone has a role to play, and we all need a sense of urgency to develop more sustainable business models and circular supply chains. At Nestlé Waters North America, we believe we can and must accelerate our sustainability agenda. We have industry-leading commitments and a long-standing track record of action, even during COVID-19, that has reduced our carbon footprint, introduced more environmentally sustainable packaging, and advanced our water stewardship practices. Partnerships have been key to our progress. Recently, Nestlé Waters and Poland Spring teamed up with one of today's panelists, the Recycling Partnership, to help consumers answer the question, can I recycle this? That has helped to inspire more Americans to recycle. While 2020 has brought new challenges, it has also brought the opportunity to build a better path forward. No matter where you or your company are on the sustainability journey, we are collectively at a critical moment in time. The global response to COVID-19 has demonstrated our tremendous capacity for addressing urgent societal challenges, and we must harness that momentum and accelerate climate action, drive towards circular supply chains, and help create a healthier future for all. Thank you, and to all of our panelists for joining this conversation today and help further this important discussion. Back to you, Josh.
Great, thanks, David. And I'll be circulating in the chat an article we wrote, in sort of conjunction with David and Nestlé Waters last year. So really appreciate, David, your support, Nestlé Waters USA's support for continuing these ongoing conversations. So as I mentioned, when we get into the conversation, please feel free to be active in the chat. We'll pull you guys in potentially even by voice if you're available. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to David KIRKPATRICK to moderate the conversation.
Thank you, Josh. And thank you, David. And thank you, Nestlé Waters. And thank you to our three really excellent panelists. And I know how excellent they are because I've spoken to all of them in the last few days. And we've got a very important topic here. We're talking about really how we keep this world alive in the big picture. Obviously, sustainability is a big word. I think when we all think about sustainability, the first thing we think about is climate change, global warming. But there's a lot of very specific things that tie into that. And we will talk a lot here about recycling, which of course is an interest of Nestlé Waters. And we have two real experts on that here. But I think what I'm hoping we'll do is tie our discussion back to the big picture as much as we can. But the thing that's also so interesting right now is that we are in such a bizarrely different time because of COVID and the pandemic and all the responses to it, both personal and economic. I think we are going to talk about how that's impacted our ability to act sustainably, both from an individual and a company standpoint. So we'll probably go back and forth between talking about companies and us as individuals. Let me quickly introduce the three really excellent panelists. And the poll is Is a poll visible to everybody? No, it's only visible to me. So I'm going to hide that for a second. Jenny Ahlen is a director at EDF+Business. EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the great environmental organizations. Interestingly, she's based in Bentonville, which is, of course, where Walmart is headquartered. And she does especially a large amount of work on food-related businesses, restaurants, supply chain issues, which I'm sure she'll tell us a lot about as we get going here. Keefe Harrison is the founder and CEO of the Recycling Partnership, a 6-year-old group that works somewhat analogously to EDF with business to try to help them do the right thing. Slightly different business model, but also a nonprofit working very closely with business to try to push the ball forward. And finally, David Rosenberg, a longtime friend of Techonomy's, who is the CEO and founder of AeroFarms, which is the world's largest vertical farming business, largest vertical farm with their main operations in Newark, vast indoor growing chambers. I don't even know, I called them a growing field. I don't know what the right terminology is. Terminology with indoor agriculture is an interesting issue. I wrote a big article about it, as David knows, a few years ago. And it's called a different thing in practically every part of the world. But if you think of giant racks of spinach and other vegetables and greens stacked 35 feet to the ceiling, maybe 12 high, with lots of lights tuned to the spectrum of red, typically, LED lights. Anyway, David will tell us more, but he's building another one in, is it North Carolina, David?
Virginia, and also Abu Dhabi, we just announced.
Virginia and
United
Abu
Arab
Dhabi, right. Sorry, I got the state wrong. But expanding, David's raised a couple $100 million for his company. Oh, this is my article. That's great. Whoever
David,
put that up
there so people can get a sense.
Show the headline, Josh. Can you get the headline down there? Oh, yeah. Okay, that's an article I wrote in 2015. There you go. Well, it's on Techonomy's website. I urge everyone to read it because I was quite proud of it. Anyway, so let me go back to Jenny to start. How do you see the big picture state of sustainability right now, Jenny, and particularly how it's changed during COVID, and you know, how companies are thinking about it now and compared to before? And make any general opening comments you want. I'll let each of you do that here.
Sure. Thank you, David. It's great to be here. You know, as you mentioned in my intro, I spend a lot of time working on consumer goods, retail, supply chain issues, and EDF+Business, the group I'm in that does the corporate partnership work. You know, we've really been seeing in this time of pandemic and also just environmental justice and equity issues really coming to the forefront. You know, we've seen an increased amount of pressure from investors, from employees, from consumers to really hold brands accountable for climate action and for rebuilding a more resilient, a more inclusive, and a more sustainable future for everyone. And so I think the pandemic has really shone a light on what happens when we're not prepared for something that's big and catastrophic and impacts people's livelihoods and their lives in very close and intimate ways. And so it's been really reassuring to see that sustainability has remained a priority, even with everything else that's going on in the world. And we're excited to see that momentum building. Even just in the last year, you know, the number of companies making net zero commitments doubled. There's over 1,500 companies, you know, who are really committed to climate, as just one example, kind of one proof point of that commitment continuing to move forward. So I'll maybe start with that.
Net zero carbon emissions, meaning, yeah.
Correct.
We'll talk real quickly before we move on about how EDF works with companies, and maybe give an example or two of the kinds of things you've helped make happen.
Sure. So we're really focused on working with the highest impact sectors. So sectors like agriculture, oil and gas, transportation, retail, to try and tackle the most pressing environmental problems that face us today. And really, most of that work boils down to work on addressing climate change and also safety and health of people on the planet. And so our model is we tend to partner with leading companies. We are different from a lot of other organizations in that we don't take money from our corporate partners. So we do our own separate fundraising to support our efforts. And we really measure our progress by delivering environmental improvement on the ground. And typically the way we go about doing that is we work with our partners to get them to commit to really ambitious goals. We want to see them collaborate with other stakeholders in their supply chains to drive action. That often includes accelerating investments in innovation and technology. And then what's becoming increasingly important is the last piece is advocating for supporting policies in that enabling environment that's going to help us tackle these big issues. And so some of the companies we've worked with over the years include, as you mentioned, I'm based in Bentonville. Walmart has been one of our long-term partners on both climate and addressing chemicals of concern and consumer products. We also have partnerships with companies like Tyson, working with them in their agricultural supply chains, trying to address issues like fertilizer efficiency and soil health.
Great, well, thank you. And just one thing before we move on, you told me when we talked that you guys started working with Walmart on greenhouse gas emissions issues in 2010, when they were really the only big consumer-oriented company even thinking about it. And then I think you told me that by 2015, they were still the only major company with that kind of a target. But now, with the leading retailer, at the time anyway, still the leading retailer, taking such an aggressive move, that really inspired an entire wave of companies. So now there's just hundreds and hundreds of companies, as you mentioned, with this kind of goal. So thank you for the work you're doing. Keefe, talk about what you do and how you see recycling in the pandemic, but also, compare what you do to what EDF does a little bit, and talk about the importance of recycling and sort of where it stands in the United States generally and also during the pandemic.
Sure. The recycling partnership was formed because there was a real lack in the recycling space of action. We, for years, have had campaigns encouraging people to recycle, but what we were missing was the change agent to make sure that everyone can. And still to date, only half of Americans can recycle at home as easily as they can throw something away. We think that's a problem. We work first and foremost on action, and then second, that it's done well. So the recycling partnership in 6 years has grown with more than $123 million pledged to grants and resources for local governments. So unlike EDF, we do take corporate dollars. In fact, we believe it's our job to insist and assist when we hear a sustainability claim around packaging. We bring subject matter expertise to the table to hold accountable and help. And we think that's a unique model. It's sometimes confusing for people to really understand, but I think it pairs up nicely with the work that EDF and others are doing to just really change the landscape of what's acceptable in the US. So the recycling partnership works foremost with communities. We have about 1,700 community partners. We're on track to put our millionth new recycling cart. This is, the cart that people have at their house that they roll to the curb. Millionth new recycling cart on the ground early next year. It was supposed to be this year, but the pandemic's pushing that one back. So we work with communities to help them how they run their programs, but we also work on policy because policy has really been missing from this space. And policy is intended to affect what brands produce and how it's recovered in the system. So we are working through policy to advance a more circular system where the end of life, if something can be recycled or reused, is determined at point of design. So think about helping communities, helping brands through the design and delivery of goods, working on policy, and then really infusing the whole space with much more in-depth data, writing reports, doing analyses, and as a nonprofit, sharing them with companies and communities alike to help us make smarter decisions about how we improve recycling.
Yeah, I really love the way you think about the whole ecosystem and work with the manufacturers of the goods that need to be recycled, with the communities where the recycling takes place, and with the companies that haul it away and recycle it. And I know you've been advocating for the construction of additional capability at the far end of the system, as well as helping consumers do it at the front end. But it is shocking to me, as I mentioned in the piece that I wrote in preparation for this session, that only 34% of Americans really actively recycle, which is kind of a shockingly low number. I mean, just quickly before we go to David, what's the biggest reason why so few people are still recycling?
Well, I think first we need to look at access. Can people? And we're not trying to get people to think about recycling all the time. We want them to be able to do it without thinking. So we want it to be second nature. So can they do it? And this is especially important in multifamily housing. Since day one, we've made sure that our grants really work to reach everyone in a community, not just parts of a population. And then second from that, then are they recycling the right things? And as much as they can. And we know that not everyone's participating as well as they could. There's confusion around what can be recycled, and people are really busy. And when you have a lot going on in your life, feeling like it's one more thing can be a barrier. But the partnership really stands on the fact that, of course, consumers, people have a role to play. But before we just jump to educating the public and making it their responsibility to solve this, we really think we have to work with the whole supply chain, like you just said, from those who are producing the raw materials to converting it to packaging, branding and selling it, hauling it and recycling it. We want everyone engaged around common goals. And we think that responsibility is shared across all of those. It's not just on the consumer.
Yeah, and before we end, I want to talk a little bit more about the economics of that. But let's move on to David. David, Keefe mentioned the words, I think David TULAUSKAS also, circular economy. I know this is something you've spent much of your life devoted to thinking about and acting on. Talk about what AeroFarms is, how it fits into the notion of a circular economy, and how you think about its relation to sustainability also.
Yeah, happy to, and great being here with you, Jenny and Keefe. And I also totally agree with what's been said. We need a system-based approach. It's very complicated. One can't just solve problems at one part in the value chain. One needs to think holistically. We need to bring the public sector in. We need policies, because there are too many externalities that will get lost otherwise. And I think the actors like the Walmarts of the world that are at the ends of the value chain have the most leverage to pull the rest of the chain along. So it's a good place to really drive behavior. At AeroFarms, so I started this journey, I'm an entrepreneur, and here looking at a lot of the clumsiness in the agriculture community brings opportunities from an entrepreneurial standpoint, because there are lots of problems to solve. And there's also a tremendous negative impact from an environmental standpoint, and it's like food's not going away, so it's incredibly important. And if you take some of the aspects of agriculture, it becomes clear how a systems-based approach is needed, as well as the policy. So at AeroFarms, we grow plants, like you mentioned, layer upon layer of growing, and we've grown about 800 varieties of plants to date. Most of them are in leafy greens, but we grow fruits, other crops, some big crops, some small crops. If you're in the New York tri-state area, you could get it on a product called Dream Greens at Whole Foods, Fresh Direct, Amazon Fresh, ShopRite's, on salads, packaged salads. And we're always trying to commercialize more crops, improving quality while reducing CapEx, OpEx. Much harder journey than I envisioned, not being from the agriculture space, because biology is just tough. It's just, you got to figure out what a plant wants and how to deliver it. From an environmental standpoint, agriculture, a lot of it like policy, take water. So in some parts of the world, in the US, you have use it or lose it policy, where if a farmer doesn't utilize his allotment of water, he loses it the next year. So it's almost perverse incentives to be a good water steward, because he doesn't know if he'll need it the next year. So you have a lot of, sometimes water is also priced per square foot or per like vertical plane instead of usage. So you have flood irrigation, where it doesn't matter how much water is dumped on, again, taking the incentives away. So at AeroFarms, for example, if I could grow a plant using 95% less water, there is relatively little economic impact in that benefit. So if I invest in capital expense in filtration or in closed loop systems and dehumidification and putting it back, the moisture in closed loop systems, there's almost no negative economic value for that. And in fact, it's negative economic value because I'm putting capital expense and depreciation or operating expense with running a filter, a certain amount. So we have to look at these externalities and how we work in a systems base. The big environmental impacts in agriculture are water, also soil depletion. So the world's losing its arable soil. In fact, over a third of farmland has been lost in the last 40 years. So it's really tremendous. Also, water pollution and comes from a lot of river runoff. And here, we've reduced the cost of fertilizers and pesticides, herbicides, fungicides to such a degree that here too, farmers can clumsily put it on, and often it just runs into our fresh water system. There are algae blooms, dead zones, and so forth. And we're also not looking at the cost of moving water around. For example, 25% of California's energy costs is pumping water. So a lot of agriculture in California comes from the Colorado River and is moved to Salinas, San Joaquin.
The energy cost for the entire state
is about 25%.
25% is moving water. That's an astonishing figure. Go on, sorry.
So there's a lot of these costs into the system that aren't easily calculated. And often it's in fact not seen by commerce because the public sector, we have this view that water should be free. So the public sector almost blinds the economics. So there's little visibility, and then the entrepreneur can't solve a problem. So the point is it needs a multifaceted approach, and it's behavioral change, it's technological change, it's policy change, and it's working with the whole ecosystem to improve it. At AeroFarms, we're trying to understand how we could improve it in certain segments of the market. The real impact is getting to the cash crops, corn, rice, wheat, soy, and how like vertical farming, it's not the be all end all by any means, but how do we ultimately drive the big agriculture users in those commodity crops, the staple crops? That's where we have more significant change. So we're sort of always thinking in that lens, how do we again reduce CapEx, OpEx? How do we improve quality so we could have a bigger impact?
And one of the interesting things people may not know about vertical farms like yours, which I mentioned in another piece I wrote this week, was that you use literally no pesticides whatsoever. So if somebody really wants clean food, they can get it from you. But quickly, how has that interest in that sort of thing changed during COVID, David?
So there's more awareness, two factors. There's more awareness of food safety. We're all very aware of what sanitization and touching and so forth. So pesticides, make sure pests don't get on the plants, herbicides, so weeds don't grow and so forth. And these are designed essentially to kill things, but we don't want those chemicals in our body. And people are unaware, most people, that even organic food has mostly organic pesticides. And sometimes you have to put more of it in. So the amount of ingestion of these chemicals, harmful chemicals, are bad. In leafy greens, for example, when it says triple washed, we don't think what that means, but it means what it says. You're washing it 3 times to get the pesticides, herbicides, fungicides off. When you look at that wash, the first wash looks like milk. And that's how many chemicals come off. The second wash looks less milky white. The third wash looks less milky white, but there's still on average 7 different residue pesticides in our food after a thorough wash, even the organics that we're eating. So there's all this like bad stuff we're eating. So the fact that we could grow without pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, it's a residue-free food that's much healthier from a human health standpoint. And we're able to achieve that from a fully contained food. The other part of COVID is it really brought out the stresses in our food manufacturing system. So we want food, and this is back to human behavior, we want it 365 days a year, and we also want it cheap. So we've had a lot of centralized production, and the centralized production gets distributed, but if there's a contamination or a crack in that, then you see empty shelves and panics and so forth, and runs on supermarkets. So now there's a trend, I think it's actually more of a fad than a trend, of democratizing our food system and have smaller food production systems all around. And we see a lot more interest, like we're building our facility in the UAE. We have a lot of interest in the MENA region. And that's going to put less risk on the food system, because now if one facility goes down, you still have several other to provide food, but there's a higher cost. You don't have the economies of scale. There's a balance. You want the economies of scale, which usually show up in automation and management. So, but you lose some economies of scale, bring up costs, and we'll see whether this is a trend or a fad. I personally think it's more of a fad. People have short-term memories, and then they're going to want like big facilities, cheaper and so forth. And here at AeroFarms, we're always trying to find that balance. What's small enough, what's local enough, and the difference between local, hyper local, et cetera.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to share the poll results now with everybody so we can just see what you all said. Okay, first of all, sustainability is more important now than before. That's nice that you think that. People's biggest concern is climate change. Interesting, number 2 came in at recycling and waste disposal, which is relevant to our discussion. So people are recycling about as much as they did before. My own recycling at home, I said, select all that apply. People find it, the majority say it's not too hard. That's maybe a sign that this is a fairly privileged crowd where they live in communities that are willing to spend on it, because as Keefe will probably tell us in a minute, it costs money to recycle. Some people are, 16% of you are confused. Okay, interesting stuff. Companies generally not doing enough. That's hardly a shocking statement, but there's some confidence that companies are doing something good. Long term, I am optimistic, not bad. 56% of you. That's probably not what the general public would say. I'm not sure. Now, I don't know if I continue sharing, I close my own. You can always close it on your own screen, I believe. Is that right? Any of my back end? No, maybe not.
I just shut it down, David.
You shut it down. Okay, thank you. Okay, so one of the things, Jenny, you mentioned investor change. That investors are thinking differently than they used to about which, and because basically, David runs a business, he's an entrepreneur, and the other 2 of you work with businesses day in and day out. And I think everyone has more or less suggested the attitude of business has shifted almost radically in recent years. And we, of course, want to see it shift further. But how much is that because we are seeing something of an epiphany among investors, Jenny? And maybe Keefe would want to, either of the other 2 might want to comment too. In other words, are the companies feeling pressured to do this?
I think it's a combination of factors. I think, folks within companies understand supply chain disruptions, right? Especially in sectors like agriculture, where you're dealing with droughts and floods, and suddenly, the availability of commodities, of different food products, they see those things in real time and understand that if they want to have product on the shelf to sell, right, or if they're a manufacturer of that product, they want to have a resilient supply chain. And so I think some of it comes within just trying to run a good, sound business, and there's motivation there. I think if you look at consumer demand, right, like we continue to see big growth and more kind of sustainable brands, right? Consumers are demanding this. There's been a 20% growth in sales since 2014 for more sustainable products. It's expected to reach $150 billion next year in terms of product sales. So part of this too is companies responding to seeing growth in these categories, right, with these products and wanting to take advantage of that. I think there's also an element of companies wanting to have some loyalty with their customers, and part of building brand trust is, taking action on issues like sustainability, like climate change, like equity and justice issues. And so I think that's another strong motivator. And then I do think the increasing attention that investors are putting on this, as we see more and more data showing that, ESG funds are outperforming some of the other funds out there, it's creating enough evidence to support this idea that many have been saying for a long time, right? That if you're paying attention to these issues, you're managing risk better as a company, and that translates into higher profits, and a stronger company. And so just in the time that I've been working in this space, it's gone from very few investors asking these questions to mainstream investors asking these questions, using ESG rating systems. I think we haven't necessarily seen all of that talk translate into a lot of action yet, but I think we're anticipating, you know, that's the next logical step where it should go, where investors start actually changing their behavior and their decisions based on all of this information. And that's a very strong motivator for a company.
Keefe, do you see that with the companies you work with, that they're feeling more pressure coming from their various stakeholders to do the right thing?
Yes. McKinsey just released a report, I think this week or late last week, on consumer intent and are they willing, you know, what are they looking for companies to do? So it is, I completely agree with Jenny. You know, I think what I'm hearing is people are asking the question of, you know, what gives companies the social license to use materials that are hazardous to our water, to our planet? And if they have that license, is there a licensing fee? You know, what comes with that? Their sense of responsibility is really changing. And that's that insist and assist that I mentioned earlier. I think that what we want to prevent when we see this pressure is knee-jerk reaction to just do something. For instance, I just saw, and I need to do some research on this, but a major alcoholic beverage company that just shifted their packaging away from recyclable PET to a compostable material. There is no infrastructure in this country for robust composting, commercial composting yet. We need it. It's something that needs to be grown, but there's, you know, with all of recycling's faults, it's still far more reaching than composting. I look at that as an example of someone feeling so pressured, a company feeling so pressured to do something that they jump. And that's not helpful. And that's why we need organizations like ours, like EDF, like others, who are helping to drive towards common goals, so that this pressure turns into elevated action that is coordinated and meaningful.
And I'll add a couple things. One is on the investor side, like you look at stocks like Beyond Meat, and all of a sudden they had a big pop in the IPO and the public activity. And there, it's a supply-demand balance where there's a lot of demand to invest in ESG-focused companies, and there's not a lot of supply in companies out there. So a lot of money chasing a few projects. So in so much as there's a lot of demand for companies that are doing good, that helps the entrepreneur raise capital. And maybe it helps with that risk-reward ratio and so forth. So that's good. The other part of, from a partnering standpoint, you have, in so much as smaller entities are better at innovating, so you have bigger companies that have this critical lens or greater lens on environmental sensitivities or awareness, and they're coming to smaller innovators and saying, hey, how do we partner here? So as an example, without mentioning names, a big CPG company came to us and said, hey, one of our inputs, our ingredients has a lot of pesticides. We want to get ahead of this. So how do we work together to grow this plant without pesticides and then use it as an input for our manufacturing? And that's great. And that brings investment, collaboration, resources that allow us to go faster.
Wait, so they came to AeroFarms to do that?
Yeah, 100%. They're chief supply chain officer of this big company.
Okay, but so far you're not doing anything that's not a direct-to-consumer product, are you, at this point in time?
Not commercially, but we're working on a product that's going to be an ingredient for this CPG company.
Really? Can you tell us any more about what kind of product that would be?
When we will, you'll be the first to know, David.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Well, we're getting a ton of really good questions in the comments. So I want to go to those, but there's one more thing that a big picture point that several of you mentioned, maybe all three of you mentioned as we were prepping. This whole idea that the economics have to shift so that it's not more expensive to do the right thing. This was a point that I think several of you specifically said. Anybody want to jump on that? I think Keefe, you made this point to me, didn't you? David's raising his hand because he definitely did too. But Keefe, I know you said something along those lines to me. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so when I tally up all the commitments to the environment that I'm seeing, I then look at what are the headwinds that are going to prevent us from getting there. So in the recycling space, especially, what's preventing recycling from thriving on its own? Well, I look at how inexpensive landfills are. On average in this country, landfills are half the cost of recycling to a community. When they drive a truck full of recyclables to the front door of a material recovery facility, the MRF that separates it, they know on average they're going to pay about twice what it costs to send it to a landfill. That's critically wrong. If we're thinking about recycling as a supply chain, we need to address that. Just as we need to address, the fact that recycled content, plastic and materials often cost more than the virgin equivalent. If that's setting the economics of this completely off. And I think it's important to remember that recycling is a supply chain. It's developing feedstock for manufacturing. And we only get the environmental impacts when that works well. When the economics of that are robust, then we get the environmental benefits. We cannot break those apart.
Okay, but what's the best way to make those two prices reverse? If it's more, if towns have to pay in order to do the right thing now, is it a national law, federal law do we need? Do we need state law? Do we need a change in the consumer demand? What would it, or all of the above?
I'd say all of the above. We just released a paper on this very thing, on the need for federal and or state policy to address those major headwinds around cheap disposal, around the price disparity between virgin and recycled content. And I think what we need there is we need to make sure that the economic commitments are matching the corporate commitments of intent. Because when it comes down to, yes, we believe it's good, but if we just don't have the money to make that happen, we just have to prevent that second part of the conversation. I see some questions here that kind of get to this, so we might get there, but let's make sure we know that communities have never flourished. Recycling has never been a big money maker for communities. They've always paid for it. Yes, there might be some revenue sharing. Yes, there's saving on landfill, but I'd love to dig into that later if you'd like.
Okay, well, there's so much to talk about. Dave, go ahead.
This is like where we need carrot and stick, and this is the importance of policy. Unfortunately, we don't have the political leadership today, but we need strong policy that rewards good actors, doesn't put good actors at a competitive disadvantage. So if I use less water or use less waste or have less pollution, I shouldn't be at an economic disadvantage because those externalities aren't factored into commerce. So this is where taxing carbon or pollution or river runoff. And here in agriculture, there's been an investigation to understand, okay, if most freshwater pollution comes from pesticides, let's tax pesticides. And let's see if that changes behavior. And lo and behold, people use less pesticides. So here we need to someone look at the line items of what's contributing to the bad activity, and then carrot and stick. Okay, you want to use a system to use less water, drip irrigation, whatever. Here's an economic incentive to make that capital investment and bring it down over time. So now you have carrot, and let's increase the price of water. There you have stick. But in all of these line items, look at what's having the negative consequence. How do we use carrot and stick? And this is where often policy, yes, it's all behavioral change. Hopefully people just step up and do the right thing. There might be a focus at where there's high political will or high pain. So the first user in San Joaquin to tax pesticides, it's because San Joaquin, there's political will and a lot of pain. So if you focus on those areas, like focus on Norway, where everyone's just like wants to do the right thing, whatever it is, but that's usually the focus point. And then once you have the pattern that works, just like an entrepreneur, then once you know, do X, invest Y, get Z, then you duplicate and you run it all over. But start with the places where we could get some early wins. High political will.
Jenny, any thoughts on that?
I would just agree that I think, for the issues that EDF focuses on, policy, federal policy is, would be one of the more efficient ways to get this right, because you need a level playing field. You need to have rules set at a federal level, ideally, to internalize some of those externalities to build that cost in, and then have a mechanism, though, that prevents equity issues on the back end, right? So if there is a price on carbon federally, how do you make sure people can still afford to buy food if the cost does go up? But I think, right now we are bumping up against the limits of some of the things companies can do that are, cost effective, right? Or cost neutral. And, it's going to need a nudge to get them to do those other things. And it's going to be a nudge like a federal price on carbon.
Although it has been very interesting in this period when obviously federal government has not made this kind of thing a priority, that both Keefe and Jenny, I think, have found companies are stepping up in the breach when government is not. And that's quite impressive. There are so many great questions. Okay. Let's see. Well, that one question from from Steve Wolf. I don't know if Keefe, is that's the one you referred to. I think we kind of touched on it. Can you look at that and see what you think?
Yeah, so what does supply-demand balance for recycled materials look like? Are the price points competitive or MRFs unprofitable?
What is a MRF?
Do municipalities have interest? MRF is Material Recovery Facility, and
Okay.
that's the plant that when a community sends their stuff to be recycled, it first has to be separated so that all the aluminum goes one way and plastic is another. MRFs are often looked to as like the indicator of the health of the recycling system, but I think we need to look much broader than that. MRFs are for-profit, generally most MRFs are for-profit entities that are responding to end market value for material. What that means is when they can see value in a big pile of like stuff, that they can sell it to someone else to turn it into something new and make money, then it happens. That's a problem in my mind because that's a reaction. That means that we're going to generate a bunch of things, and if we can combine enough to see some value in it, that we then have an environmental impact of saving that natural resource, that's reacting to something that's already being produced. What I'm interested in, and this gets to Steve Wolf's question of, who has to pay for this? Our communities are paying for the bulk of the entire system right now. I think we need to share that cost across it. And we need to think about this. We need to shift from a linear economy, which is you make to waste, you make something for its use, and then it's done, to a more circular economy where the intent of that product is determined at the point of design. So leaves on a tree turn into nutrients for the tree. How do we apply that same sort of thinking to the goods that we as people need? And so we're really thinking about not just how do we make more things recyclable, but how do we think about the design and delivery of goods that support human life, and looking at what's in a household, including textiles, organics, and not just traditional recyclables. We're really trying to push to a broader system.
Okay, before we move off this big point, okay, David, real fast. Yeah.
I see one chat about insurers, and I think this is a great point. One question is like, do they have a role? And it takes a lot of brain power to figure this out, but I think the answer could be a big yes, where you can envision a lot of insurance is about reducing liability. So there's a liability that we're putting on the environment. If there's a mechanism to require companies to have some responsibility for this liability, and a mechanism where insurers, in so much as we all need insurance, and there's a mechanism for insurers to ensure that, and our premiums go down if we're good behavior, I don't know what it is, but that sounds really like a great idea, and there's something there. Another thing that comes to mind is this, like the sell side analysts, and this is more related to public companies, but in so much as the sell side analysts have the behavioral change of always asking about ESG related items, then you get leadership getting trained to talk about it and answer about it. So there could be some tremendous pull, just asking the right questions.
I do want to go back to Keith for a second, because one of the other questions was about, somebody who said, since China stopped, Jeffrey Boudin said, since China no longer accepts paper recycling, he and his family now shred their paper, mix it into their compost. Now, that raises, I'd like you to address this China issue, but also, I have often had the impression, and I think I've even read, that some communities gather so-called recycling and it ends up getting dumped anyway in last couple of years when the ability to dispose of it wasn't fully available. Is that still happening in some instances?
So that's a couple different questions. I think the audience might be interested in knowing that we track carefully how many programs are paused and how many resume because of COVID. So you might have seen pandemic impacts in community recycling programs. And we know that there are still about 50 that are paused, but 84 have paused and resumed. One of the biggest cities that's paused right now is Baltimore, and they have about 230,000 households. So think about 230,000 families who currently are not able to recycle. And the reason why they can't is because they have a personnel issue. They have a hard time hiring people because they have an antiquated system that is very human focused on picking up the material and getting it to the MRF. That's why we have been working with them for years and just issued them a multi-million-dollar grant to be able to switch to an automated system that serves every family in that town, not just some. It really expands it at no cost to that community, really getting more out there. And I think that's the type of shift that we're looking for to make sure that everyone can. So that's one thought on COVID impacts and the cost to a community. How does that connect to China? Well, people might have read that China used to take a lot of the US's recyclables and over time have stopped. And the reason that they did that is because we were increasingly sending them really messy loads of material that had some recyclables in there, but was not a pure recycling stream. And as why were we doing that? Well, because it made economic sense to us. This gets back to economics. It was cheaper for us as a collective industry country to send loads to China to be sorted by people there with different human rights standards, with different environmental standards than handling it here. And so that became our status quo because it was the bottom line, right? That was the cheapest thing to do. When China said, nope, we're not going to take your trash anymore, we're not taking this, then it shifted back to the US to begin to manage more. And this isn't just a US problem. This happens in Europe. This happened all over. And I think that's a good thing because what we're doing is leveling up the standards and we're getting right with what does the cost, what are the returns? How do we balance this out? There's almost $4 billion worth of new paper mills being built in this country right now. The plastics industry has expanded to respond to this. So it's not just that I don't want people to think that China somehow hurt us. I want instead for us to think about global markets and how they attach to the environment. And really, this is again why we need policy to create common standards and to allow the companies that are making goals have a fighting chance of delivering the sustainability that we need them to.
Yeah, good. Anybody else have a comment on that? Or I got a great question coming from the audience, but I don't want to not let anybody else say anything. I'm going to go to Chris Lubkman. I'm going to let you talk, Chris. Chris is a professor and great thinker of many. Maybe quickly identify yourself, Chris, and then ask or comment as you see fit.
Thanks, David. Hi, David. Good to see you. Two Davids, I know. Hey, great to see you. My name is Chris Lubkman, and I'm in Zurich, Switzerland. It's wonderful to see all of you, and thank you for your wisdom. And I used to be at Arup, and now I'm at Switzerland at DTH, but enough on that. So one of the things I say a lot as a futurist, everything inconvenient will change. If we look back over time, innovation is really about the obviation of inconvenience. It's defined in different ways in different cultures. But for each of you in your work, how does that resonate with you? Because Keefe, you just mentioned this inconvenience of the human piece. And Jenny, working with some of the folks you work with, you're just trying to find out those points. And David, same with you. So I'm really curious how that resonates with you. Thanks.
Jenny, start. You start, Jenny.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the challenges we face in a lot of our work is it's maybe the combination of convenience and just habits, getting people to change habits, whether that's talking about practices a farmer chooses to use, changing that. How do you change that? It's inconvenient, to have to learn something new, to make something more complicated, to be fearful that there's risk involved. And I think in a lot of ways, this connects back to, we can work with companies, right? And a lot of what we do is proving what's possible, right? Proving that there's a business benefit to this work, showing new models, proving that sustainability is good for the environment and for the business. But there are points where it is inconvenient to change, right? And you have to look at the whole system that these folks are operating within and think about what are the incentives, right? Why are they making the decisions they're making? And you need to make the status quo inconvenient so that they are willing to change, right? And to do things in a different way, in a better way. And so I think that's part of the role of policy, right? Is we need that to help shift some of the things from being convenient in the status quo to being inconvenient, right? And not the decisions that we want folks to make.
Anybody else?
I'll give a couple examples. So on a technology standpoint, most seeds are bred for pest resistance, drought resistance. So if we are able to say at AeroFarms, for example, we got pest resistance, we're covered. We got drought resistance, we're covered. How do we breed for taste, texture, nutritional value? So all of a sudden we have these not inconvenient seeds that could be bred differently to have unlock tremendous value for us, for the customer, and so forth. From a behavioral standpoint, an example is the customer, like packaging. People in the US want hard clamshell plastic that's so wasteful. In Europe, in Switzerland, they probably have much smarter bags that use a lot less plastic. So how do we get customers to look at bags and not think of a product as an inferior product just because it's in a bag versus a lot of wasteful plastic? And that's an example there. And then from
you said you'd love to switch, but you're still using clamshells because customers won't consider your product a premium product if it comes in a bag, right?
Yeah, and this is an example where, like, if a Walmart says, "Hey, we're only bags now," then that has a tremendous push through the whole supply chain, and we're actively thinking, how can we just be bold and try this out and push people to use our product in a bag as a premium product, and getting out there. But I think it is going to change. There needs to be a mind shift.
Jenny, one of the things you said to me when we talked was, the percentage of all these harmful things that are driven by consumer behavior. I mean, could you just talk about that? Because I mean, I think it's very healthy that we have two groups here that are totally committed to working with business. When the environment comes up, typically a lot of people are inclined to just, cast enormous blame and opprobrium on business and say it's all business's fault for destroying the planet. And there's some truth there, but talk about how you look at that issue.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the statistics on food and consumer products, some estimate that 60% of global greenhouse gases are tied back to how those things are produced, transported, used, and disposed of. 80% of water usage, 2/3 of tropical forest loss. So the things we buy and consume on a daily basis, have a huge impact on the planet. And so, personally for me, like, I take responsibility, right? Like, I make decisions every day that have impacts on the planet, right? And through my work, I understand what those are and try and make more informed decisions. And so I think, there's a component of this where it's great if consumers can be informed and, take some responsibility, because we're all part of the problem. But it's also unrealistic, right? Like, most people are busy. They don't have a lot of time. They're not me. They don't spend their career thinking about these things. They're making decisions in seconds about what product to buy and why. And so companies do have a really important role to play in terms of providing information, being more transparent about the products, whether that's the chemical ingredients and the safety of those products, whether that's the carbon footprint of those products, how to recycle labels. There are a lot of things companies can and should be doing to help consumers then be able to make better and more informed decisions. Because you ask a consumer, no one's trying to, accelerate climate change through their purchasing decisions, right? They just don't know, and they don't know how to compare, and we've not made it easy for anyone to do that. And so that's where I think the responsibility for companies really lies, is in creating a system that enables consumers to take on a little bit of that responsibility too, right? And to support companies who are doing the right thing, to buy products that are better for the planet, and to create an incentive structure for companies to do more of that work, because they need the positive feedback loop. They need to see sales increase. Like, that is how this is going to scale and sustain itself. So,
hey, David, 20 seconds on how companies can do that. One is, I'd encourage everyone to check out the US Plastics Pact. We just launched that in partnership with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Common Goals. And the second, I encourage people to Google Pathway to Circularity, which is a series of work groups of how do we change the problem of those plastic bags. Less than 4% of those are recycled right now, to getting a higher success rate. We have to do that together.
Really good. Anybody, something you've wanted to say or hope to say that you didn't get to? We've got 2 more minutes, so we do have to wrap, but I don't want to I don't want to lose any great thoughts that anybody came with that they haven't had a chance to tell us all.
Say that, like, the social side and in our environment today, in today's charged social environment, how do we bring up people to a better life? And So like at AeroFarms, we've committed to hiring a lot of past offenders, and in lots of ways, just how do we train people and constantly bring up. I think more and more businesses have to take a stand or just have to take the initiative to focus on that element.
That's a nice way to add something in. You have 170 employees, I believe, and so a lot of them are former incarcerated people, but they're now trying to improve their lives. That's great. I want to just make one comment before Josh takes us out here. I attended a session this week with the current and former directors of IndieBio, which is an investment group investing in bio innovation. And they've got a new book out. One of them is Poe Bronson, who's a longtime author, who's now the current director of IndieBio, and this guy Arvind, whose last name I forget. But anyway, he was the previous guy. They're both amazing. But one of the key things they were saying is that there is unbelievable innovation around sustainable biological methodology to replace things like meat and all kinds of things that are extremely labor intensive and energy intensive and resource intensive, and to use the mechanisms of bacteria and fermentation, et cetera, to achieve goals that we have unfortunately relied on nature to do in the past with great despoliation. So there is a sign of hope there, in addition to, I think what we've heard today, a lot of shifting psychology among both consumers and businesses. Obviously, we want that shifting psychology to continue at pace. And I really thank all three of you for I thought it was a really information-rich discussion today, and the energetic conversation in the comments and questions, I think, underscores that. So thank you, and over to Josh.
Great. Thank you, David. Thanks, Jenny, Keefe, and David Rosenberg. Hopefully we'll get together in New Jersey again soon. Really appreciate the conversation. I think, again, one of the key takeaways, right, talking about incentives and sort of the financial structures around this, and how do we get that right. So really appreciate everyone's input. For those of you on this, we'll be sending a link to the video. It'll be up early next week, so please feel free to share that with your colleagues and other people who should be part of this conversation. Thank you again to Nestlé Waters for helping make today possible and really helping support some of these important conversations. Really great to work with a brand who is thinking big picture. And to David TULAUSKAS, who just joined us, on the Zoom. I circulated earlier sort of an article we wrote about with David and Nestlé last year. So please feel free to check that out. I also put in the chat some information just again on all the great things Nestlé Waters is doing during this pandemic time. So really appreciate everyone's support and attendance today. For those of you who are members, we'll be moving over to the sort of VIP session where we'll continue into more of an open dialogue around some of these topics. So really appreciate again your time, and thanks for joining us, and stay safe and stay healthy. So thanks again.
Thank you all.